G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. This video kicks off my F1 Fantasy 2025 content. So if you're new around here, you're either new to the game or an experienced F1 Fantasy strategist, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. There'll be plenty more F1 Fantasy content between now and the Australian Grand Prix and throughout the F1 calendar for this season. So be sure to stay tuned for all of the latest episodes that drop here on my channel. I'll also be on Twitter throughout the year for any real-time updates that you want to get on drivers and constructors. But I think in terms of my first video and kicking things off for the year, I wanted to start with my top tips for F1 Fantasy, a combination of lessons learned from myself over the years, as well as feedback and other kind of opinions and questions and such fielded from you in the F1 Fantasy community. So I've tried to collate as much as possible into this video, and we'll get through it one by one with my 5 top tips. Let's start with how to build your foundation of your team, the skeleton of that I like to call it. And I think first things first, you want to identify from the off 2 to 3 assets that you can hold for at least 2 to 3 races. The reason I say that is because we are bound to encounter fires we want to put out in our team, issues, etc., that derail our initial strategy week to week. And having those reliable A tier, B tier, C tier drivers, the premium teams or the premium drivers and constructors, and then the midfield and back market guys that we can hold for a couple of weeks and just let them tick along with scoring points. Not have to worry about them, know that they're going to do the job and get it done week to week and address other issues or priorities in our team without having to worry about these guys. Who they are, it can be anyone from experienced drivers at the front of the pack to those guys in the back of the pack. And realistically, I do think it can be drivers, it can be constructors, but I do believe identifying those early on and rolling with them for the first few races of the season will mean you can prioritize other issues that, as I said, do crop up from time to time. If we're looking at the midfield and back market drivers specifically, which are sometimes much harder to gauge, looking at poor qualifiers such as Magnussen last year, that could be a Behrman in the Haas this year, or known midfield commodities. I look at Hulkenberg, albeit he is in a Sauber, which was extremely pedestrian last year, or Gasly, who had a unstoppable last few races of 2024. These guys are known. We know they're reliable. We know what we're getting from them. And I do think, again, to my first point, because of the fact that we know they can score points, DNFs aside, it's just one less issue to worry about when we are addressing other competing priorities week to week. So I think that skeleton, that foundation, it could be a Leclerc, it could be a Hulkenberg, and it could be a McLaren constructor. We know those kind of drivers and constructors are going to score us points most weeks. So identifying them early on will mean your team can be set up for, at least the foundations of it can be set up for a few weeks heading into Japan, China, etc. In terms of how we build out the baseline constructor pairing and what that means for early budget gain, I think what constructors are priced at will very much dictate how the F1 Fantasy template shakes out in the early stages of the season. And what I mean by that is last season, I think the game was a little bit better at pricing assets, but it certainly wasn't ideal. And I think constructors are still very much underpriced. They're about 2 to 2.5 points per million. When you look at a driver, it's about half that. So what you're paying in a constructor, which you get 2 drivers worth points, you're paying the same for what you get in a driver, which is obviously 1 driver's worth of points. If constructors are priced, let's call it above the premium constructors, that is, so Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, if they're priced above 27 to 30 million, it's going to shake out in how we build our teams. Now, I do suspect Mercedes definitely and Ferrari could come in at just under 25 million, and that is what we consider the B tier asset class, 15 to 25 million. A tier obviously above 25 million, C tier under 15 million, and more on that in my budget building guide, which will come out later in March. But I think how constructors are priced, given they were underpriced last season, will very much dictate how we build our teams. And what that means for budget gain, as I mentioned, the B tier assets, and I think that could be Ferrari and Mercedes, how or which assets we choose to invest in will build the most budget for us early on. We saw in 2024 those fantasy managers that went in on B tier drivers and constructors in the early stages of the season had the most budget by the end. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people go down this path, because the B tier asset class is the asset class that has that nice hybrid, that perfect sweet spot of points and budget gain. You don't get the budget gain in the A tier, you don't get the points in the C tier. So I think the B tier is really that nice middle ground that a lot of people will probably invest in to build out their budget without forsaking too much in the global ranks. In terms of differentials and punts, given the fires I mentioned that we may have to put out, other issues in our team that we may have to address, and going for those reliable, consistent commodities in drivers and constructors, limiting those differentials and punts will mean we can actually, again, mitigate additional variables that we just don't want to worry about early on. So I do think those differentials and punts are probably rookie drivers first and foremost. I'm looking at the likes of Liam Lawson, Kimi Antonelli, maybe even Bortoletto in that Sauber. That's awfully slow. I do think just avoiding them for the first couple of weeks will mean you're able to restructure your team if you need to realign where you want to target budget growth points, etc. So again, we won't know what those differentials look like until we get to free practice in Australia. But I do think trying to go towards a quasi template build early on will certainly mean you don't have to worry about too much other kind of stress points in your team as we move forward. In terms of chips and transfers, golden rule in F1 Fantasy: do not make transfers before practice. Do not book in transfers weeks ahead of time. We don't know how drivers and teams are going to perform at certain tracks until we get to free practice. So don't make knee-jerk decisions if you've had a bad race week and bring in drivers without knowing how they're going to go at the next circuit. Booking in transfers more than a week ahead, also probably not advisable. I don't think I have an issue with maybe looking one race ahead, but any more than that, given we already have 2 transfers a week, definitely not something I'd encourage week to week. In terms of making transfers and making excessive transfers, we get 2 free transfers each week with the option to roll a third if we choose to only use one in that current race week. If you make any more than the allotted transfers per week, you're hit with a -10 to your score that race weekend. It's not the end of the world if you take -10 transfer penalty hits, but I wouldn't recommend it every single race week, and I would only recommend it for premium constructors and drivers where there's probably a bit more upside to recoup any of like the points deficit you might have between driver A and driver B. Drivers in the midfield and back market drivers rarely score more than 10 to 12 points a race week. So you're not really actually seeing any numerical gain in making these extra transfer hits if you're swapping a Hulkenberg for an Albon, for example. I just don't see the payoff points-wise there if you're making those additional transfers. In terms of chips, there are 6 unique chips. We've got the 3x DRS boost, the limitless, the no negative, the wild card, final fix, and autopilot. As of right now, before the game launches, those 6 chips were what we had in 2024. You only get to use them once, if I can get my words out, not great for a first video this season, once each this season. That means that once you burn it, you're not going to get another one in the second half of the season, let's call it. I know in some fantasy games, there is the option for a second wildcard or a second something else, but we only get, as far as I'm aware for 2024, one use of each chip. In terms of how we use them, again, I will have a comprehensive chip guide coming out very soon, but be flexible with when you want to deploy them. I think a plan in mind, I'm not saying it's the meta plan, but one that sprung out to me when I looked at the calendar last week was that you could build, for example, a budget building team. We go back to those B tier assets I was talking about just before in Australia, then Limitless in China. Limitless is optimal to use in the early sprint races of the season, China being the first sprint race, and then wildcarding out of that budget building team in Japan into something a bit more conducive to what the meta lineup with a bit more budget at that point could look like. Again, there's going to be plenty of different alternative strategies in mind, but that's one such strategy. And if you choose to deviate from the plan, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but just have an alternative in mind if you choose to go down a different route, because I found you can very much have tunnel vision going into a race weekend, and then free practice or whatever it might be could certainly upend those plans. So having alternatives in mind should you need to deviate from your original strategy, is certainly a prudent approach to take. As I mentioned on the chips, I'll have a full chip guide out once the game goes live, but I have a video on my channel from last season if you do want to take a look on how the chips work, when they are optimally used, and who best to use them on. In terms of something that can be easily overlooked in fantasy games, patience and persistence is something that I think is one of the more underrated aspects of playing fantasy sports, particularly in a game like F1 Fantasy where you've got a lot of chips to use over a 24 race week season. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of people activate the 3x DRS boost in Australia. It happens every year. You see hundreds of thousands of people want to get an early rank in the global leagues. They'll activate one of the most powerful chips, the 3x in Australia. The 3x is best used on a sprint race weekend and typically later in the calendar as well. More on that, as I said, in my chip guide. But you will see people use those chips early on. That's just not optimal. And again, as I said, play your own way. There are plenty of different ways to skin a cat. But if you're playing to the letter of the law, the 3x DRS boost is going to be used by a lot of people in Australia. Waiting for those weekends to use the optimal chips, no negative in Brazil, limitless in maybe China or Miami, etc., are some weekends where you're going to make more rank gain when planning ahead. In terms of the opposite of what a good start could look like, if you have a bad one, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Ranks are going to fluctuate significantly early on in the season. People are going to be using chips. Points are going to be all over the shop. Just trust the process. Do not panic too much. I've had seasons where I've started 1.5 million out of 2 million and come back and finished in the top 2,000. There's absolutely nothing wrong with looking at your rank in the global leaderboard and seeing it above 1 million after a couple race weekends. A lot of us started on RB with Ricciardo and Tsunoda as a constructor last season. Didn't go that well in the first couple of races, to be quite plain, but there was still enough races in the calendar and enough pivotal junctures to use chips effectively to claw back that deficit. You know, some people who were on RB, I know, finished in the top 100. So there's still really not that much to worry about if you have a couple of bad races in Australia and in China, Japan. And as I mentioned, you know, staying engaged over the whole season will reap the rewards. I do think it's very easy to be discouraged early on if you're not doing as well as you hoped. But as I said, chip guides, budget building approaches, optimal times to deploy chips in certain transfers, and using your transfers effectively to respond to free practice results will definitely benefit your team and your rank over the entire season. And we've definitely seen those people who stay the course the entire year are the ones that typically finish higher than those that might drop off after a few races or by the summer break. One thing for me that's really important in F1 Fantasy is blocking out the noise. Number one rule when consuming Twitter and YouTube content is try and limit as much as possible over consuming content. Now, I think it's very easy to get caught up in watching 6 or 7 different content creators. You know, I'm at fault myself of doing this because I follow so many great, talented content creators on YouTube and Twitter. But I do think having those go-to creators that you love watching and listening to and reading are the ones that I think will streamline the decisions, make the statistical insights and information more digestible, and also avoid the possibility of conflicting opinions on different viewpoints. I've got different opinions on Charles Leclerc to what, you know, Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ or Ewan or Tom or Zach or Rain, any of those guys out there that create fantasy content. We all have very similar opinions on certain things. We also have very different opinions on certain things. So I think making sure you know who your go-to outlets are for content is one such way to block out the noise there. I think another thing when approaching free practice specifically is to narrow down your decisions you want to make. The hour before the deadline, particularly when there are deadline streams and information flying from every angle of the F1 Fantasy universe, can confuse how you want to tackle the weekend. Now, I try to go into FP3 on Saturday with 2 to 3 options at most in mind with how I want to use my chips or how I want to make my transfers. I've been in the past making rash decisions an hour before the deadline simply because of the fact that Mercedes look good in FP3, yet they've been nowhere to be seen in FP1 or 2. I think having those, let's say, objectives or transfers in mind and using FP3 more as a confirmation than an influence or a negative influence to your decision making is probably one such way to go about it. Everyone's got their own unique approach, but I do like to have 2 or 3 different paths I could at most go down should I see anything in FP3 that looks a little different to what maybe was expected in the first 2 practice sessions. In terms of trusting your decision-making process, data is becoming much more prevalent in F1 Fantasy in the last couple of seasons than it might have been in 2021, 2022. There are some excellent sources out there. F1fantasytools.com, far and away the best F1 Fantasy resource, I think, for most engaged strategists. There's also F1 Fantasy Tracker. And then in terms of other sources outside of dedicated F1 Fantasy resources, free practice times, an excellent data point, I think, for me. There's also the race and quali simulations that F1 put out. To me, that one I feel is a little hit and miss, but I do think having those go-to data sources to lean on for simulated points, for driver performance, confidence, etc., will definitely make it easier to, again, narrow down those decisions. In terms of a little bit removed from the decision-making process, if you've had bad weekends, there's absolutely nothing wrong with stepping away for a couple of days from your F1 Fantasy team. I've had plenty of stinkers, certainly in 2024, more bad weekends than I had good weekends. And taking the time on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday to just not look at the team, not tinker, and then revisit, pick things back up again Thursday, maybe Friday, as we're getting through free practice, means you're able to just not stress too much and overindulge in F1 Fantasy content. It's very easy to, again, consume too much and maybe muddy the waters a little bit as to what the best route is when you're consuming information every single day of a race week. And taking that time out over those extended periods of time, there are multiple times in 2025 where we've got 2 to 3 races, 2 to 3 weeks between races, and then the summer break, which is a 4-week break. Just taking that time to completely remove yourself from F1 Fantasy. I do it. If you notice, or follow me on Twitter, you'll notice I don't tweet for a couple of weeks at least in summer. And that's just for me to disconnect entirely from F1 Fantasy. I do that selfishly because it means I come back refreshed for the second half of the season. If that's something that you think's effective when addressing your F1 Fantasy conundrums, then I would highly recommend it as well. And then I think the last and most important point is having fun. F1 Fantasy is first and foremost a fun game. It shouldn't be one that gets to a point where you're not enjoying it, where you're bored or not really entertained by it. I think you want to play it your way. And I think, there's a certain degree of playing it to score points, understandably, but also making it enjoyable as well. If there's ever a point where it's causing anxiety, it's affecting your mental health, then I think absolutely just step away from it for a few weeks. And it's very easy to be stressed out about things when they don't go your way. So I definitely think making sure you're enjoying it, and if you're not, then put it down for a couple of weeks and then maybe pick it back up again. That's just my 2 cents, but I think your health and wellness and your mental health should absolutely be first and foremost when playing these kind of strategy and maybe even luck-based games to a certain extent. So if you want to come along for the ride, be sure to join me because there's a lot to get through between now and the end of the year. But as I said, guys, first one done and dusted. We'll be back again soon. But drop a like on the video if you haven't done so already, and I will see you all very soon.